Hey Know Why listeners, what is going on with Texas public schools and the Bible? A couple of weeks ago, my home state went viral for a new required reading list that the State Board of Education approved to be implemented by 2030. Now, the reason it went viral is because included on this list of required reading were passages and stories from the Bible. Cue somewhat of a freak out by a lot of people. Here's a sampling of some of the headlines. This is from the BBC, not even an American-based publication. Religion row as Texas makes Bible stories required reading in schools. From the New York Times, Texas public school students will be required to read the Bible. From CNN, Texas State Board of Education votes to require millions of students to study Bible stories. This is from another publication, The Conversation. Texas approves mandatory Bible readings in public schools, reigniting a century-long debate. So what is that debate? Well, it has to do with the First Amendment. And so in this episode, I want to talk about the First Amendment, how it relates to religion and expressions of religion in public schools based on some Supreme Court precedent, and just kind of talk about what are some of the updates in general, because this did kind of cause a big stir. Even though it was in Texas, it's caused national and international news. And so I wanted to dig into it for myself and help us understand what's actually going on in the state of Texas. And I think it's relevant to our conversations about education, no matter where you are. So let's look at the First Amendment. By the way, everybody needs to know the First Amendment of the Constitution. It's the First Amendment in our Bill of Rights. And the first right listed in the First Amendment has to do with the freedom of religion. So here is that sentence. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's it. That's the first right listed in the First Amendment of the Constitution. Now, there are two clauses here, though, that are important to understand and distinguish between. Clause number 1, the Establishment Clause, okay? That's the part of the sentence that says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That means that there is no state religion in the United States. There is no official state religion of the federal or state government. The government cannot require you to adhere to a particular religion, and there is no state church. Now, even in the colonies, certain colonies had state churches or denominations that were the official church or denomination of the state. Obviously, many of the people who fled to the New World were leaving religious persecution in the Old World in Europe, where there was a state church, and they were persecuted because they weren't worshiping according to the tenets of the state church and things like that. So the founders clearly wanted something different. They did not want there to be an established church of the state or an established religion of the state. Now it also goes on, the Free Exercise Clause. This is the part of the sentence where Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. So that means the government can't prevent you from freely practicing your religion. It doesn't say that Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion within the four walls of your house of worship. It means that you are free to practice your faith, period. So what is interesting, and let me note this really quickly though. You've probably heard of the phrase wall of separation between church and state. Well, you might not know this, but that's actually not in the Constitution. It is a quote from Thomas Jefferson that he wrote in a private letter while he was president, and it has really been taken out of context over time. I'll link an article or two in the show notes that kind of explains the original context in the letter that he was writing to a religious group at the time. So it's kind of an interesting story, but in terms of constitutional precedent, the words of in a private letter from a former president do not have the same weight as what's actually in our Constitution in the Bill of Rights, which is the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. So just to clarify that, the wall of separation is a popular metaphor that we know, but it's not actually in any of our official binding documents as a nation. Now, in the past, what's interesting is that attempts to honor the first clause, the Establishment Clause, have actually been taken so far to the extreme that they have ended up violating the second clause, the Free Exercise Clause. And this is something that some more recent Supreme Court decisions have rectified. One example is Kennedy v. Bremerton School District, which made it clear that government employees don't lose their freedom to exercise their religion just because they happen to be employed by a government entity. And so basically what was happening in practice is that government employees, whether they were school teachers or there are some other examples as well, were basically having to pretend that they had no religion, because you had employers, government employers, telling them, like, if anybody even sees you like praying or doing anything related to your faith, that's an establishment clause. Well, I think most people are smart enough to understand that just because a religious person works for the government, it doesn't mean that that government is now establishing that religion of that employee. People need to still be able to have the freedom to exercise their religion. And there's a difference, and maybe some people might argue it's a fine line between being able to exercise that and imposing it on somebody else. But the whole basis for a pluralistic society where we do have religious freedom is that people are able to exercise their rights and their own beliefs. And we need to be able to exist with that. And just because somebody else is exercising their faith, it doesn't mean that it's imposing their faith onto me. So anyway, that's something that has been cleared up in more recent Supreme Court decisions. But that was a problem, because if you're using one part of the sentence that has to do with religious freedom to violate another part of that same sentence that has to do with religious freedom, I think you might be missing the point. So just to clarify that. Now, I think when many people heard about these requirements for public school students in the state of Texas to be required to read parts of the Bible, immediately they thought of the Establishment Clause. I think that's what a lot of people, when they think of religious freedom, because of how famous that quote from Jefferson is about the wall of separation between church and state, I think the Establishment Clause is kind of what people are most familiar with. And that's kind of the first red flag that pops up for a lot of people. So a lot of people, and this is a totally valid question, we're asking, okay, does this violate the Establishment Clause? What is Texas actually doing here? Why are they requiring students to read the Bible in the future? So this is a totally valid question. And it's actually pretty easy to find the answer, and that's what I'm going to get into in a few minutes. But I do want to consider one other Supreme Court precedent. This is the School District of Abington Township v. Shemp, which is a Supreme Court decision decided in the 60s, I think, basically establishing that, or confirming that, states could not require students to open their day by reading the Bible and reciting the Lord's Prayer. So there were actually a couple different lawsuits that were combined into this decision, where in the state of Pennsylvania, and I think maybe some school districts in Maryland, or maybe it was just one, they were requiring students to begin the day in a religious devotional way, reading a passage of scripture and reciting the Lord's Prayer, which were more acts of worship. And so the Supreme Court said that you, as a state or a school district, you can't require students to do that. Now, here's the interesting thing, though. In that same case, in that same decision, the justices were very clear that that did not mean students could never study the Bible in public school. Here's why. Let's look at some of their quotes here. This is from a concurrence of the main opinion from Justice Brennan. The holding of the court today plainly does not foreclose teaching about the Holy Scriptures or about the differences between religious sects in classes in literature or history. Indeed, whether or not the Bible is involved, it would be impossible to teach meaningfully many subjects in the social sciences or the humanities without some mention of religion. So that's an acknowledgement right there that when you are discussing things like literature, history, social studies, you're going to naturally talk about religion because humans by nature are very religious. I think it's like the latest data that I saw from Pew, 75% or over 75% of the world's population is religious. So it makes sense that when you're studying humans, either the history of humans or the philosophies of humans or the writings of humans, there is going to be religious content. And he's saying, so in those contexts, it's totally appropriate and even expected that one might study the Bible. We're not going to avoid that. It's a difference between studying that in the context of literature or history or how it's affected human events over time versus like, okay, we're all going to open up the day with this very specific religious prayer. Here's another concurrence. This is from Justices Goldberg and Harlan. That's also really interesting to just take into consideration. There is, of course, nothing in the decision reached here that is inconsistent with the fact that school children and others are officially encouraged to express love for our country by reciting historical documents, such as the Declaration of Independence, which contain references to the deity. They go on to say such patriotic or ceremonial occasions bear no true resemblance of the unquestioned religious exercise that the state has sponsored in this instance. So they're saying, okay, in the case that they are looking at, the state was sponsoring or even requiring specific religious exercise of students. But it's interesting to note this because here you have Supreme Court justices acknowledging once again that religion has played a very important part in our nation's history. Even in our founding documents, they acknowledge the reference to God in the Declaration of Independence. So does that mean because the Declaration or other documents in our nation's founding or other things throughout history, because they mention God, school students can't recite them because that would be an establishment of religion? No, they're not forcing students to become Christians or to believe in God by acknowledging something that is in our nation's history that happens to reference it. That's common sense for a lot of people, but it is important that they noted that. So I wanted to mention that case precedent just for more context as we go forward and talk about what the state of Texas is doing. So really what we see here, based on kind of that context there from the Supreme Court precedents and what the First Amendment actually says, is not the question or the concern isn't necessarily that schools are requiring reading of Bible passages, but why and how it's being done. And like I said, it's pretty easy to find the answer to this. I will link this along with the relevant pages so that you can see it. But if you look at the agenda of the State Board of Education's meeting where they actually voted on this and approved this, it has all the information in there. So the Bible stories and passages that are in the new State of Texas required reading list come from a revamped required literary works list that was recently approved by the State Board of Education as part of the TEX English Language Arts and Reading Program. Now, TEX stands for Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. So these are this is like the curriculum standards that Texas sets, okay? So these are revamped Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills English Language Arts and Reading Program requirements. So in other words, this is English, okay? This is for their English class, their literacy program. These are required literary works, and they revamped the whole list, and it included some Bible stories and some passages of the Bible on there. So again, that is very much in line with the concurring opinion that I just quoted from, talking about the study of the Bible in the context of history or literature or social sciences, and that's exactly what's happening here. But let's go and dig in a little bit more. They actually include some of their justification in here in the agenda, which again you can read for yourself. This is a quote. The proposal would ensure that all students in the state of Texas have the opportunity to read the same literary works. I actually think that's a great goal. What they are trying to do here is create a shared body of knowledge and literature that students in the state of Texas share. This is actually not revolutionary. This is pretty common historically in terms of educational standards to have a shared canon of general, like, great works or classics or things like that a culture or a group agrees upon. And it doesn't mean that you can never deviate from that or read outside of it, but kind of everybody who receives this kind of education is going to at least have these things that they've read in common. And that's really great because that provides a common knowledge base. It provides fodder for being able to discuss and debate and even have differing opinions. But it grounds everybody in kind of the same set and roots of knowledge so that they can have conversations. This is a little bit of a tangent, but I think maybe part of the reason why we're starting to become so polarized today is that we don't have this. There's not really a common body of knowledge that students are studying anymore. So the fact that Texas wants to create that for their students, I think is a good thing. And you can certainly quibble or criticize with the selections that they've made, but the goal of creating a shared body of literary works that all students in the state of Texas have in common, I think that's a worthy goal. All right, here are a few other things in these requirements that I actually really like once I started digging into it and reading about it, because I care about literature and literacy skills in general. I'm a huge advocate for people to read more. I think a lot of people are. And just a reminder, our nation is in a reading crisis. I could list multiple examples, and I'm happy to link some in the show notes. And I've talked about this in previous episodes of the podcast and on Point of View Radio, where you have professors at prestigious universities saying, we can't get our students, our incoming students, to read. They are having to adjust their syllabi to severely cut back on the amount of pages that students are expected to read every week. They are having students who are coming in to college who have never read a full book, because so much of the education standards have changed today, especially to prepare for standardized tests like the SAT, where they're only reading short passages and chunks instead of whole books. So they're not having that practice of reading entire books. And so you have college students who've never done that before, and so they don't have the reading stamina or reading comprehension level. This is something that is concerning people across the political spectrum, all the way from the right to the left. I don't think there's really anybody who actually understands how bad the reading crisis is, regardless of what their political beliefs are, who are like, yeah, that's fine. I think everybody, and this was even starting to be a problem before AI, which made it a lot worse. They're like, yeah, this is bad. We should probably know how to read books as a culture. So this is that I am sure, I don't actually know for sure because I don't know the people who created these requirements, but I would imagine it's very likely that some of that is going into this revamped literary works list. At least it should. I interviewed Brad East on the Know I podcast, and he was one of the ones who told me directly that he had a student in his class who had never actually finished a book before he took his class in college. So this is a real problem. All right, now let's dive into some of these new requirements again. Here's another quote. The literary works required by this section represent the minimum literary works to be read by or for students in that grade. Okay, so again, this is the minimum. This is not an exhaustive list or an exclusive list of they are only allowed to read these and nothing else. This is the minimum. Additional literary works to be used in instruction may be selected at the local level. So if teachers or local school districts have concerns that maybe this list that the state has given them is not diverse enough, or they want to have more content in there, then they can approve that. They can supplement it. This is just the minimum required number of literary works and what students need to make sure that they are reading in school. But then at the local level, they can add more, which I think that kind of freedom is great. Now they do add this: when making local selections of additional literary works for instruction in English language arts and reading, school districts and charter schools should prioritize texts with content that reinforces required student expectations of knowledge from other subjects, including social studies. I think that makes total sense, basically saying we want to give kind of a comprehensive education. So the more something that they're reading ties in with another area of learning, the better. Again, that makes sense to me because you're reinforcing things from a bunch of different angles, but still, that doesn't mean that you can't have flexibility in terms of supplementing the required reading list, which again is a freedom that I think you should totally have at the local level. Here's another thing I love. It is recommended that students read from printed versions of required literary works as opposed to digital copies on digital devices. This is such a move in the right direction because there is so much research that is showing that students retain information better when they're actually reading on paper versus on digital devices, that students retain information better when they write and take notes by hand versus typing or on a device. And you're seeing this whole backlash, well-deserved, against ed tech, which really just took over the last decade or more. So we've talked about this on the No I podcast. I don't need to rehash it all, but this is totally a move in the right direction. And I think you're seeing a lot of school districts do this. In fact, I think it was Sweden or maybe Norway. I'll look it up to verify, but they were one of the first countries to like wholesale adopt all this ed tech that was being pushed by big tech companies. And they are actually now one of the first countries that has totally reversed and invested in all paper textbooks and like pencil and paper products again. So I think you're going to see more of that trend as people realize that the ed tech isn't working. So I love that Texas emphasizes this here, that like give the students real books. Don't make them read little passages on a Chromebook. Give them an actual book to hold. I think that's great. Now, this is also very important. Parents can opt out. A parent retains the right, this is a quote, to temporarily remove the parent's child from instruction in a required literary work that conflicts with the parent's religious or moral beliefs. So it goes on to say that, teachers are encouraged to give alternative reading and assignments to students in those cases. So this is super important. One, for people who are concerned about imposing a certain religion, which I would argue that these requirements do not actually do that. But if parents are concerned about that or they don't want them to read the Bible at all, then they can get an exemption and they can actually remove their child from that portion of the instruction. This is also great for conservative parents because what if a school district supplements with a work of art or work of literature that maybe somebody who's more on the conservative side doesn't want their child to participate in? They can withdraw their child from that. That's parental rights. That's parental choice. Parents should be able to do that if something conflicts with their religious or moral beliefs. And so I'm really thankful that Texas made that explicitly clear here. Okay, so we've gone through some of the details here. The goal here is to create a shared body of literary works that all students in the state of Texas have in common and have read. This is minimum requirements, and if local school districts want to supplement, then they can, and they're encouraged to do so in such a way that it kind of is cohesive with the entire body of knowledge that students are receiving from their curriculum that year. Parents can opt out if they want to for moral and religious reasons. Students are going to be encouraged to read on, or schools are encouraged to give students the opportunity to read in printed books instead of on digital devices. So all of these things are great, and that's important context before we dig into what are they actually required to read. So I went through and I looked at all of the passages and stories from the Bible that they're required to read, and I'm going to list them here for you in case you're curious. So they start, and I may have missed one, but again, you can look for yourself. The stories start based on what I can tell in first grade. And so I'm not going to list every single grade that correlates with these stories, but it just kind of goes up. There's typically like one story, one or two stories or Bible passages per grade going from first grade all the way up through 12. So do you have Noah's Ark, which is actually a kid's storybook, not even the Bible passage, starting in first grade. Then it goes up David and Goliath. Again, that's a kid's storybook. Daniel and the Lion's Den, a children's storybook. I think this is about grade 4. This is where they start reading passages of scripture. So this is Luke 14, verses 7 through 11. So 4 verses of the Bible. And it has to do with the parable about humility. The passage ends like this. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. That's kind of a common adage. We hear things like pride goes before a fall. So this is a little passage that's talking about humility. There is going to be in one of the grade levels study of the life of Moses, which includes passages from Exodus. Actually, it's just 2 chapters. So chapter 3, which is about the burning bush, and chapter 14, which is the parting of the Red Sea. So any kid who has seen the Prince of Egypt, nothing new really is going to be covered for them in the passages that they're reading. You do have a passage in another grade from Matthew 6, about 10 verses, verses 24 through 34. This is about be anxious for nothing. This is the passage that says, look at the birds of the air, for they do not sow or reap or store away in barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. What about the flowers of the field? Not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. And then ends with, don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Again, anybody who is even like loosely familiar with religion has probably been raised with hearing some of those sayings. So these are very popular Bible passages, especially the next one, Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And then later on in that passage, it says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Another passage that is included is Matthew 5. That's the Beatitudes. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall see God. Or maybe it's blessed are the pure in heart. I used to have that memorized, actually. But so that's another very famous passage of Scripture. Ecclesiastes 3. To everything there is a season. There's a time to be born, a time to die, a time to mourn, a time to laugh. Lamentations 3. The parable of the prodigal son. People are familiar with the term prodigal and prodigal son. A lot of people may not realize that that story actually comes from the Bible. And then there are some selected chapters from the book of Job. And this is in English too, which I think would be 10th grade. Other passages to round it out are the creation of Adam and Eve in Genesis 2 and 3. And then 1 Corinthians 13, which is known as the love chapter. Faith, hope, love. These 3, the greatest of these is love. If anybody's ever been to a wedding, there's a high chance that they probably have heard some quotes from that passage as well, because it's very commonly read at weddings. So those are the stories and passages, and that's all of them, that will be read from kindergarten or really like 1st grade all the way up through 12th grade, starting in the year 2030 in the state of Texas. So I want to dig in. I didn't do this with every single grade level, but you can do this if you want. And I did it in a couple just as an example to see, okay, why is this passage selected for this grade level? Is there some sort of reasoning or theme here? So let me tell you what I found. Let's start with 8th grade, just as an example. This is where Ecclesiastes 3, to everything there is a season, and Lamentations 3 are included. So what is Lamentations 3, by the way? That might be something that off the top of people's heads, they're not really familiar with. So I'll just read a few verses from this whole chapter. It starts like this. I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of the Lord's wrath. He has driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than light. Indeed, he has turned his hand against me again and again, all day long. He has pierced my heart, this is a few verses down, with arrows from his quiver. I became the laughingstock of all my people. They mock me in song all day long. He has filled me with bitter herbs and given me gall to drink. He has broken my teeth with gravel. He has trampled me in the dust. Yeesh. Okay, very sad, going on and on and on. And then here's where it gets to the part where people might be like, oh, wait a second. Yeah, I'm familiar with this. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. So one, that's where a very famous hymn, Great is Thy Faithfulness, comes from. And what is the theme there? Well, let's look at some of the other literary works that students in 8th grade are going to be required to read. You have the novel, The Giver by Lois Lowry, which is a dystopian novel, if anyone's familiar with that. You also have the book Night by Elie Wiesel, which is an autobiography of his time in captivity in a Nazi concentration camp. I haven't read it, but a very dark and brutal account of the atrocities that he suffered and survived there. There's also a poem called The Survivor, which is about the guilt of somebody who has lost friends and comrades, and they're the one that comes out alive, and so wrestling with the guilt of that. You have Teddy Roosevelt's Man in the Arena passage from a famous speech that he gave, where he says, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming." And it goes on from there. Another thing that is included in the literary works for that grade level are a poem by Walt Whitman, "Oh Me, Oh Life." It's short, so I'll recite it here for you guys. "O me, O life, of the questions of these recurring, of endless trains of the faithless, of cities filled with the foolish, of myself forever reproaching myself, for who more foolish than I, and who more faithless, of eyes that vainly crave the light, of the objects of mean, of the struggle ever renewed, of the poor results of all, of the plodding and sordid crowds I see around me, of the empty and useless years of the rest, with the rest me intertwined, the question, O me, so sad, recurring, what good amid these, O me, O life?" Answer: that you are here, that life exists, an identity, that the powerful play goes on, and you may contribute a verse. Nice little poem. Okay, so what's the theme here? All of those things that I read, including some passages from, you see it very quickly, a theme of struggle, of hardship, of overcoming despite hardship, of also questioning what is the meaning of life. And so when you look through it in that lens, these passages of poetry from Ecclesiastes and Lamentations actually fit within that theme very well. So it's like, okay, it makes sense why those would be studied as just two of the selected literary works, like those, one chapter and then a few verses from another chapter, along with multiple other books and poems and reflections on the struggles of life and questioning the meaning of life. So another example would be English 2, and that's where you had the passages from Job. Let me find that here to see what some of the other ones were. Okay, so yes, this is English 2, and if you're not familiar with the book of Job in the Bible, let me just put it this way. It's a tragedy. And it actually does end on a hopeful note. So in that way, I guess in the traditional sense, it's not a complete tragedy, but it's tragic, it's sad, it's dark. And so what are some passages of Job read alongside in English 2? Julius Caesar by William Shakespeare, The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, Dante's Inferno, and multiple eulogies of famous people from throughout history, all the way from ancient times to American history. So there's a theme there of tragedy, loss, darkness, death. So once again, you say, okay, it makes sense that the book of Job, which again, up until I think more recently, when we really started having more biblical illiteracy, these were kinds of things that were often referenced in literature as stories from the Bible, whether or not somebody was particularly religious or not, that were just kind of part of the common imagination because they were so familiar to a lot of people, and they definitely go with the theme. So those are just two examples from 8th grade and 10th grade where you see, okay, these aren't just, this isn't a devotional time. This is part of English class, and there's clearly a theme here with the books that they're reading. Another document that I found showed examples of how you could teach this in class, where you have an anchor novel. So for instance, The Giver by Lois Lowry. And then you have several other passages that might be shorter, like poems, speeches, a passage of scripture, things like that, that go around it to kind of add some additional context or reflection for maybe other people who are wrestling with the same themes in different literary forms. So it kind of makes sense in terms of how you might approach English language arts instruction. So I wanted to quote from the Wall Street Journal editorial on this because this is from their actual editorial board. I think they did a really good job of kind of situating a lot of these readings in our cultural context. So this is just kind of an extended quote from them that I'll read. One is a passage from Psalms. Again, they're talking about the required reading that we just went through together. One is from a psalm that will be familiar to many readers, religious or not. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, the psalmist says in the King James Version. That language has been echoed by everyone from Nelson Mandela to the rapper Coolio, who used it in his 1995 mega hit, Gangsta's Paradise. Another passage is from Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season, it says, including a time to be born and a time to die. No, that lyric wasn't written by the Byrds in 1965, and even atheists who hear turn, turn, turn on oldies radio might want to understand that that song is drawing from a deep well. So then they quote the late writer Christopher Hitchens, and he actually wrote this essay in 2011 that they quote from here. For generations, the Bible provided a common stock of references and allusions rivaled only by Shakespeare in this respect. And Hitchens was writing particularly about the King James Version. It resounded in the minds and memories of literate people, as well as of those who acquired it only by listening. He added, a culture that does not possess this common store of image and allegory will be a perilously thin one. And they end their op-ed by saying, for the record, he was an atheist, meaning Hitchens. So again, even atheists can understand that in our culture that we live in, biblical image and allegory has really influenced our imagination and common language. And when people don't understand this, then they miss out on a lot. Just like if you don't have just like a glancing familiarity with Shakespeare, then there's so much that you're going to miss, whether it's jokes that are included in movie or other books that are actually retellings of a certain, myth or play or story over time. Like there's so many themes and stories that are just told over and over again. And so the more widely read and educated you are, the more you're able to understand, and it gives so much richness to our imagination that we can share. So I do want to ask a couple of questions though. Why the Bible? Why not other religions? Why not other religious texts? Well, again, this is whether you like it or not. The Bible had a very large, profound influence on American culture. From our founding fathers, and they acknowledged this, even though many of them were deists, many of them professed Christianity, but a lot of them didn't. But even Thomas Jefferson acknowledged that he drew on wisdom from the Old Testament when drafting the Declaration of Independence. And so the Bible influenced everything from our founding to our cultural imagination as Americans, as we just talked about, and not just America, but Western civilization as a whole. Now, you actually do have people, especially the further left you go, so this is like more common, I think, maybe on the progressive side, but they don't want to teach Western civilization. But we live in Western civilization. Like we can't help that. Our nation, our culture, even our continent is situated in Western civilization and has been influenced and affected by that. And so when we study Western civilization, that gives us context for understanding our philosophical, intellectual, and cultural roots. And by the way, studying something so that you can understand it does not mean you endorse everything in it. But we have to understand it to understand where we are today. We have to know where we came from. And by the way, there's a lot of good things that came out of Western civilization, like democracy, for instance, and the list could go on. But these are things that have influenced our culture and our nation even to this day. And if we don't understand that, then there's going to be a lot about our present times that we don't understand. Now, this doesn't mean that we can't or shouldn't study other cultures. And in fact, I think it's really good for people to study other civilizations to study world history. But in America, it makes sense that we would give priority to studying American history and culture, and then what directly influenced that, which was Western civilization and culture. It doesn't mean that we study that to the exclusion of other things, but it also makes zero sense to study other world history and civilizations and not study the civilization and tradition that directly influenced our nation. So it makes sense that we are studying things that are particularly relevant to America, even if we're studying other things as well. And I'm all for studying religions, by the way, from a purely secular perspective. Again, if the vast majority of the world's population is religious, it makes sense that if you just want to understand humans, that you need to have at least a basic kind of foundation of knowledge about different religions and what they teach. From a Christian perspective, so this is just personally, I think that Christians should be familiar with other religions, because how are we going to understand where people are coming from or even talk to them about our faith if we don't know what they believe? So I am all for the study of world religions and multiple religions. Like, there's actually somebody who tweeted something that I responded to after this. He said, if you're a Christian genuinely wondering why it's bad for the state of Texas to require Bible study in public schools, imagine how you'd feel if your family lived in New York City and Mom Donnie required Quran study in public schools. And I responded saying, this isn't the gotcha most people think it is. Because, first of all, this isn't Bible study in a devotional sense, but the study of select stories or passages of scripture in context with other works of literature that are on the same theme from a English language or literature and history and social science context. It's in English class. And if at the local level a school district decided that they wanted students to also read passages from the Quran as a Christian parent, I would actually be fine with that. Because like I said, from my personal beliefs as a Christian, I want my kid to be educated about others. So if it was in the same context of we're forcing our child to pray Muslim prayers, or we're opening the day with a reflection from the Quran, but we are just reading this in literature class or history class, or all the students have to take a world religions class and study what different religions are teaching and they're all taught, then that's fine. Like, that's actually not controversial to me. And if, like in the state of Texas, I had the opportunity to opt out as a parent, then that would be even better, because if they were teaching something that I didn't want them to learn, I could opt them out of that. So anyways, when people say that as a kind of like, oh, this is just what Christians want because they're trying to proselytize, it's like, well, no, that's not the reasoning here, and that's not even my reason for defending it, even though I am a Christian. I think this is more about well-educated citizens who are understanding the intellectual and imaginative and cultural influences of their own nation and civilization throughout history. Now, I do want to say, again, I think this is a huge step in the right direction. And this is just as a citizen of the state of Texas and the United States, and as a Christian, this is a good step in the right direction, not primarily because of the Bible passages included, but because of the robust reading program. Because like I said earlier, we are in a reading crisis. Like, this is a huge problem, that you are having adults who are not reading books, who you have college students who are actually, like, professors are having to dumb down their classes because what college students were able to read a few generations ago, they can no longer do. So if we want to make sure that our nation and our students actually are well-educated people who are able to follow a thought throughout an entire book and actually understand it, then, oh my gosh, we have to train them to read from a young age. So the main reason, now having looked at it for myself, that I like the requirements that Texas is going to implement is because they're going to be reading a lot of books in school. And it's like, that's what they should be doing. You should be reading books. You shouldn't just be reading little chunks on your laptop. You should be reading whole books. You should be having robust discussions about literature. And so I'm really happy that there is going to be a shared canon of classic works that students in the state of Texas who are in public schools are going to have to read. And they're going to have to read the whole thing. Like, that is going to give Texas students an edge. So I'm happy about that. And I think that it is totally appropriate constitutionally and just culturally and historically that certain passages of scriptures are on there. But I'm not like, oh, yay, as a Christian, like they're including Bible passages, because here's another thing. From a Christian perspective, this is not Bible instruction. This is not discipleship. This is not evangelizing. And I don't think any Christian parent would think that it would, but just to clarify, like if you are a Christian parent and you're sending your kids to public schools in Texas, this is not any sort of replacement for actual Bible study and religious instruction that they should be getting at home primarily and then secondarily at church. And again, I think people would know that, but if people are again thinking this is some sort of kind of Christian nationalist thing, as a Christian, I don't want government schools to be discipling my kids or anybody's kids, because that's not the government's job. That's the parents' job to disciple their children. It's parents' job to pass on their values and to teach the truth to their children. And we live in a country of religious freedom. So even if religiously I disagree, I respect another parent's rights to pass their values on to their child. It is not the government's job to pass religion on to children. It is, and this is a whole separate conversation. I don't even think it's the government's primary job to make sure that students are well educated, but that's the system that we have. And so it's good that if that system is actually educating, and so if they're requiring the reading of whole books, that's a good thing. But it is not any sort of replacement to the kind of discipleship or study of scripture that Christian parents need to make sure that they are doing with their kids at home. And so that, for anybody who's concerned about like the Establishment Clause or Christian nationalism or anything like that, that should actually make you feel better that, you know, Christian parents aren't sitting here like, oh, yay, now our kids are getting Bible study in school. No, this is just literature. This is just English. This is study of classic works that have influenced Western civilization and American history and culture. And whether you like it or not, those are the facts of what has influenced our culture. And local school districts have the freedom to supplement that list if they think that it falls short, which again, I think is great, because I'm a federalist, and that means that we should have as much local control as we can in different government contexts. And so if local districts are able to supplement that according to their students' needs or what their teachers think is appropriate, then that's great. But everybody at least is going to have a minimum list of required readings in common that are relevant to America's founding and culture and history over time. And I think that's a positive. So that's the story about what's happening in the state of Texas with regard to the new required reading list and Bible passage requirement. This episode went a little bit longer than they normally do, but I really did want to dig into the document for myself so that I could understand what was going on and so that you could understand what was going on too. So hopefully this gives you some context and helps you understand it a little bit better. Feel free to share this episode or clips of this episode with anybody who might be discussing this, and let me know what you think. Feel free to comment below or email me at nowhypodcast.com, and I'll see you next time.